and thanks for joining us. My name is Janelle Mullen from the Cooperative Credit Union Association, and we are here for our webinar Wednesday session with Velera on shared branching fraud. I'm happy to welcome Zach Huff to the webinar today. And Zach, I'll let you do your own intro here and take it away. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Janelle. Definitely happy to be here. And as Janelle said, Zach Huff, I'm risk strategy manager for Velera. Been with the company for about 5 years. I've worked kind of in a number of different channels. Currently, I oversee primarily the shared branch network, as well as Zelle and then our fraud intelligence team. So very excited to be here. Thank you all for joining us. Today, really, my goal or our agenda today is really to kind of give a bit of an insight into really industry-wide the fraud trends that we're seeing, as well as specifically within the shared branch network, specific trends that we're seeing within there. We'll also try to go over some kind of tips and tricks and mitigation tactics of things that we recommend our credit unions do to protect themselves, around fraud. We will also talk about ID check. This is a newer authentication tool that Velera has deployed, basically an in-branch authentication measure to help reduce fraud losses. And then lastly, just some best practices and mitigation tactics that we always recommend and like to highlight. So as I mentioned, we'll kind of start off going over industry trends. So kind of what we're just seeing in the network. It may not come as a huge surprise for many on the call, but definitely seeing an increase industry-wide within fraud. Not just shared branch, right? Kind of what we're looking at here is shared branch fraud trending. This is very close to, I think, the fraud that we're seeing really, across multiple channels. We continue to hear, right, that fraud is on the rise, both attempted fraud, fraud losses, different types of fraud, and want to dig into, specifically what some of those type of tactics are that we're seeing, the most increase in and the most impact. Kind of a highlight here, one thing I think that really to call out is 2024 and 2025, really seeing pretty big uptick in the overall fraud attempted over the last 2 years. The good news, we are still maintaining a high percentage of fraud declined, kind of keeping our losses in check. But if you look kind of at the dark blue compared to the light blue, that's going to show you kind of our losses compared to fraud that's been declined. So you can really see, right, over the last 3 or 4 years, there has been a pretty big increase in those attempts. So yes, to kind of dive into specific trends that we're seeing, right, and kind of where we're seeing a lot of that increase. The primary one that stands out here, right, obviously is misuse, right, and I think this comes in a lot of different forms. I think there's, definitely been, something we've heard in the industry here for the last couple of years, really, which is, right, members, kind of have, at least the majority of members have a perception, right, that it's okay in some situations, to commit first-party fraud. I think a lot of these times, right, we're, probably thinking of, maybe a dispute reason, did not receive where, they truly did receive goods, different scenarios like this. Again, keeping in mind that this is not specific to just, shared branch. This is kind of holistically kind of what we see across the board. So I do think that's, kind of an important call out. Again, with misuse being, just such, seeing such an uptick with that fraud type, we kind of have to ask ourselves too, right, is, how does that relate to, shared branch or can that relate to shared branch? And I think, that is something that we we do see on occasion. I guess for me, I think more of, potentially deposits that are, going through the account itself, whether that's at a shared branch location or at your individual branches, right, the funds are being deposited in the account one way, and oftentimes, the spend or the transfer of funds, the movement of money, is done elsewhere. So, I think that is one area that, we may see, some of the misuse type fraud, thinking of scenarios like, we see a fraudulent check maybe being deposited, they immediately take out a cashier's check. And a lot of times we kind of hear some stories from members, right, that, some of that is looking for a kickback from the fraudster or, something along those lines. Kind of prevalent, trends that we're seeing, of course, this has kind of been the nature of the last few years, but synthetic ID fraud, I kind of like to talk about, identity theft, with account takeover, social engineering. To me, we see these all kind of have components, within the same trends more often than not. Again, we see these, specifically like social engineering, just to kind of take that as an example, right? We have bad actors that they do a lot of pre-work, especially I think when it comes to these type of fraud trends, right? So they're collecting information. They're oftentimes reaching out to members, getting more information, or taking steps to kind of bypass controls, whether that's trying to solicit or phish an OTP code, or whatever that looks like. But oftentimes there is that direct, contact with a member ahead of actually, committing any fraud, right? So they're doing a lot of kind of data collection, a lot of pre-work ahead of, these type of fraud events. And furthermore, I think, within these type of fraud, they're a little bit more persistent, I think. Transactional fraud, a lot of the normal fraud that we think of, a decline is oftentimes the end of the fraud run. But I think with account takeover, there's a lot more time invested. There's a lot more effort that's already kind of gone in with that pre-work, and therefore, decline typically isn't going to stop the fraud trend. They're going to try to bypass that one way or the other. Now, whether or not they're successful, of course, is kind of up to us. But certainly I think what we're seeing with a lot of those trends. So to take a little bit more of a look at account takeover, I think we think about shared branch fraud, right, as more of, I guess account level fraud in general, right, as more traditional fraud. What we see though today is, fraudsters are taking more of kind of a technological approach, right? Again, even with the way they're collecting data, the pre-work that they're kind of putting in, we see very sophisticated fake IDs being created. And then additionally, kind of mentioned the social engineering, aspect of it, right? They're doing all that work to, get the members' information. And then, right, they're going to do something with that. So oftentimes we see that, and then they're calling into their issuer, calling into call centers and, trying to make changes, trying to get more information, either bypass controls, things like that. And we see a number of different technologies leveraged in that process. I know we've seen, phone number spoofing, we've seen voice synthesizers, right? We're starting to see more like deep fake type technology being used, different things like that. So, right, I mean, a lot of these, I think to the human ear or human eye, are pretty easily identifiable. So, really opportunity for like frontline staff really to be educated, to know what to kind of look for, what are those red flags, being able to, identify if there is some manipulation, if the voice doesn't sound right, different things like that. I think the same applies, right? A fraudster standing within a branch location. There's certainly, oftentimes red flags there that we see tellers, continuously pick up on. And so we always recommend, just remaining diligent on that front. Kind of, looking at the individual standing in front of you, right? The account history, kind of looking at that, incident or that event holistically. So, one, focus on your authentication measures. Does this account make sense for this individual? Then furthermore, what does the account itself look like? Is there shared branch activity? Is there account level activity? Have they made large deposits? How new is the account? Those type of questions. A couple other items here, I think that also facilitate, back to the social engineering aspect that, we kind of continue to see, right, is that, in that data collection, I think there's tools out there that really make this a little bit, unfortunately, right, easier for bad actors. That third bullet here, I think, is a good one to kind of highlight, is phishing as a service, right? So, essentially it's, kind of a package that, a bad actor can leverage where, they're going to help kind of automate some of that process where they're reaching out and, oftentimes within that social engineering, they're trying to mimic the bank process, right? So think of the members receiving a call to verify activity, and in that process, they're kind of asking some personal information, right? They're trying to gain that account level information, things like that. But they're doing so under the disguise of, we're your institution trying to verify this unusual transaction. So I think just an opportunity really for members to be, aware and educated in that area as well. And then the last one here, this is I think probably one of my strongest recommendations, at least, is that multi-layer fraud approach. So, right, we mentioned multi-factor authentication here, right? That's going to be really big, right? Being able to, fully vet your member, whether that's over the phone, whether that's in the branch, but additionally layering that with additional controls. So that may be rules, that may be, limits within your, within your core for withdrawals, or for, creating some check floats, or some payment holds there. But really just kind of that, right, that layered approach where, it's not just up to the teller to identify that something doesn't seem right, right? We kind of want to have some systemic controls on the back end as well to facilitate that. So some just kind of high level impacts that we're seeing account takeover having on the industry. So $15.6 billion. So that really the estimated fraud loss with this fraud type last year. Really, right, that's a very large number, a large portion of, I think, the overall fraud loss, right, as well. So, and again, we've kind of highlighted, right, we're continuing to see, increases in this space as well. So we do expect that the number, industry-wide will continue to grow. Kind of to go along with that, 24% of consumers are now reporting that they've been a victim of fraud. Right, that's a pretty sizable amount of the overall consumer base. This is also a big increase looking year over year, going from 18% to 24%. And then the last note here, right, I kind of mentioned, right, with account takeover, it's a little bit more involved. There's more effort kind of going in. Fraudsters are not as likely to give up. They're also working to circumvent certain controls, things like that are set on the account. So, right, as a result, we do see that, account takeover losses per incident is significantly higher than a transactional fraud event or other type of fraud events. We'll talk a little bit about synthetic identity theft and really just identity theft in general, right? So, fraudulent applications, fraudulent accounts being created, things like that. And really, I think a main driver for this is really, right, I know we've seen a historic number of data breaches over the last few years, impacting a really high number of consumers. Right, almost weekly, it seems like we're getting notice of a new merchant or a new payment processor, or someone that has been involved in a data breach. So we know, right, there's a high volume of personal information, account information already out there, right, and a lot of that's, right, being sold and purchased on the dark web as well. And so we know that, right, that's obviously going to continue to pose some challenges for all of us in this industry. So really our recommendation, right, I mean, of course, it's always going to be, really important to have, strong underwriting controls, but, additionally, I think being able to vet those accounts, not only at the point of like the application or of creation, but when we start to see activity, right, we mentioned, looking at that holistically and looking at the age of the account and the type of activity that we see on that account. And I think those are all going to be powerful tools, right? If we don't catch it at the account creation, right, we have additional opportunities, before we're looking at a large loss. Those are really going to be, I think, beneficial for, again, frontline staff, for tellers, things like that are, they're involved in that, those initial kind of interactions with that, that member or that bad actor. We'll talk a little bit about authentication strategy, and how we can kind of leverage that some to fight fraud as well. So we kind of have this broken out into a few different parts, right? Identification enhancement strategies. Obviously, we want to keep, member, top of mind, in these scenarios. We've always got to balance, right, the friction that we're creating with, with some of these either tools, right, or these strategies within, and if it's rule-based strategy, et cetera. And then additionally, right, technology that can be leveraged. We'll kind of dive, a little bit into, most of these, I think, later in the presentation as well. But just, yeah, to kind of focus on, right, some of them. So your identification strategies, excuse me, right? So, talking about, again, that holistic, view of your members and their activity, having that kind of holistic view, right? So what does it look like for that member, taking their fraud data as well as, your valid data, being able to kind of compare, right? What's normal for your normal, for your normal members, and then what's normal or what's common, what's most frequent when you're looking at just your fraud activity. And I think that can really help to kind of segment out, right, those high risk, those high touch type scenarios. Multi-factor authentication, have to kind of mention this one again. That's a strong tool. I think we're seeing this in a lot of different channels, a lot of ways in the industry, right? I know this is a way to verify activity. It's a way to verify your members that we're seeing. I mentioned we've recently rolled out a tool called ID Check, right? And that's really targeted at that authentication step. So with that process, members will have to go through. They'll upload their ID, right, and they'll have to provide a one-time passcode to the teller, which verifies, right, that they've gone through the proper steps to verify ahead of time. This really takes, I think, some of the burden off of your frontline staff, off your tellers, right, and it kind of lets the technology kind of do the work for us, right? So I think it's more efficient. It's quicker. You don't have to go through pages of activity, anything like that. Really, right? This is really verifying that we feel that the person that is in the branch, right, has been vetted, right? We've looked at the ID submitted, not spotted any red flags, things like that on there. Enhancement strategies, I think again, kind of tying this back to account takeover being one of the most prevalent fraud trends that we see, right, is how do you secure that account? One of the challenges, I think, is that with account takeover, again, they've invested so much time. It's really kind of common that one member may be impacted by an account takeover event more than one time. And so I think, right there, there's an opportunity to, make sure that we get that bad actor out of the account and that we protect that account so that we don't see repeat events. Not only because, that's definitely not, it's definitely not an experience that you want your members to go through, is having to deal with that multiple times, if the account's not secured. So, right, things like having, maybe a verbal password on your account, right, you obviously want to get the accounts closed down, get them replaced, right, so that the bad actor no longer has the financial information, things like that. We also see, I know we also kind of see this again, in the call center, and so some opportunities there, right, is if one thing actually, when I was kind of on the front lines, one thing we would do is if we don't believe we're talking to the member, put them on hold, call your actual member. They're going to tell you if this is valid or not. And that, I think that's a really good way as well to, if you're on the fence and don't know for sure if there's a bad actor trying to access accounts or multiple accounts, that can be one way to confirm and really kind of understand, if this is, true fraud or if this is valid. So member focused actions, one thing kind of to highlight there, we're always kind of balancing, fraud and valid, both, I think is important within the authentication, process. It's also important within our rules. Here's kind of where I talk, maybe a little bit about kind of that layered approach, right? We want to have strong authentication, but you're right. If it's a good member, we want to make sure that they're able to access their funds, they're able to transact and do business as normal. On the other side, we kind of take the same approach within our strategy creation. So we constantly, look for the member feedback on, if the alerts that we're sending to members are good alerts, right? Or were we wrong on this one? And, we need to go back and look at optimizing our rules for better member experience. Additionally, we're always trying to, stay on top of the current fraud trends. I think that's extremely important, not only for the fraud teams, but also, frontline staff and individuals within the branch, so that they kind of know what to look out for as well. So yeah, a few other, opportunities, I think, within, within the fraud management aspect. One, I would call out, being able to detect anomalies, right? So, if all of a sudden, you see a large spike in a certain transaction type, or right, all of a sudden we're starting to see a lot of high dollar withdrawals that exceeds a normal average, for that transaction type, those can definitely be indicators that that there's some fraud going on. With these, I think it's also very important to to have data that supports this. So being able to kind of look across your portfolio and have those high risk attributes kind of at a glance, right? I mean, that's going to really help us be able to detect if there's an anomaly going on. So if we see a large influx in activity with any of any channels, really. We talked a little bit just about the consumer engaged fraud. Again, this I think this is a really prevalent trend industry wide. We see a little bit of this within the branch space, not necessarily maybe as much as other channels. But again, we do see where, traditionally we think about fraud as being focused on a specific, channel or a specific, maybe product, things like that. So, if they're targeting Zelle, for example, right, they're usually sticking to that. That's not always the case anymore. A lot of times, right, again, we're seeing where, maybe they're depositing funds via an account or a wire transfer, and then they're doing card transactions afterwards. So, I think it's valuable, right, to monitor anyway, right, that funds could be moved around or removed from an account. I do want to, kind of talk a little bit about really the biometric, deep fake, or sorry, deep fake fraud management. Really just right, fraudsters are definitely getting more savvy. They're getting more sophisticated. They're using technology to their advantage, right? And so as a result, we certainly need to do the same. Again, some ways that we do this, I kind of mentioned we'll dig into ID check a little bit later in the presentation. That is one of one of the great, one great way to really address that type of fraud is right, using technology to kind of focus on that authentication process, making sure that the member that we have is truly who they say they are. Right, and with those checks, there's a lot of different data points that we're currently leveraging. Looking at the ID itself, obviously, right, to determine if it's altered. There's multiple data points even within a single ID that that we would want to vet through. To try to determine if it's manipulated. Sometimes we can see, sometimes they're obvious. We had a recent example where, everything was really well done, right? I mean, we could not tell just by the ID itself that it was fake. Outside of just the signature, obviously looked like it had been generated. It wasn't someone's true handwriting, right? And so, just little details like that sometimes can kind of bring those to the top. And so, with ID check, that is one thing that it's kind of looking at, right, is all these different data points to determine if, if something is, doesn't match, what is typical for, IDs of that state and things like that. So linked analysis, this is really a tool that we use internally and highly recommend, right? And so this goes along with being able to get that kind of holistic view of your member, of your data, being able to combine different sources, different channels to connect the dots, right? So, if fraud starts in a call center and it ends, with a credit card, or it ends in shared branch, right? Being able to have that visibility that, hey, the first point was, the call center, and then being able to kind of trace that right to where the fraud, is occurring. I think there's, definitely also value in, being able to say, hey, this phone number, was fraudulent when it accessed our contact center. Now we're seeing it, accessing our shared branch contact center, or maybe it's a device ID, right, that we saw go through ID check, and now we're also seeing it, in an online banking channel, right? Those are maybe insights that, hey, let's flag these IDs, these devices, right? Identify the accounts that they're accessing, right? And that's going to help kind of lead you to the fraud. And so this is a practice that our team uses pretty heavily. And so we refer to it as fraud hunting. We are working on getting linked analysis, getting shared branch data incorporated into linked analysis. Right now, we are we currently are reviewing the data from these different channels and kind of combining them, but a soon follow will be to incorporate this into our linked analysis channel. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, focus a little bit more on shared branch, the processes that we're using, and then we'll kind of dig into a couple of trends that we've seen here recently. Some highlights and recommendations here, in terms of fraud management. So within shared branch, we do give clients the ability to choose their own risk tolerance level, and so this is done just via a form. The result, essentially, is that we can tailor the rules to that tolerance level. So we have rule sets for high, medium, and low tolerance, and we'll assign those rule sets essentially based on client preference. As I kind of mentioned earlier, right, each of these kind of comes with one, obviously a different risk tolerance, but two, the member impact is going to be a little bit different with each, right? So your high risk tolerance, that's going to be the most forgiving, the most member friendly, all the way down to your low tolerance, which is going to be the most stringent around fraud trends. It's going to have the most robust rules. kind of expect a little bit higher false positives in that space. Additionally, we do have global rules as well as custom rules, right? So let's say, we have a low risk tolerance, but we're still seeing something come through. Those are opportunities where, having that rule, having the rule aspect of it, the ability to go in there and almost create real-time rules to address a fraud trend is really beneficial. And so this is really the approach, right, that we kind of take. And so we do send alerts on, I want to say pretty much all of our rules will generate an alert that will go out to our institutions. And based on the feedback that we get from those rules, right, that's going to help us do a couple of things. One, train the rules that we have in place. Right. So if we're consistently getting this is valid, this is valid, this is valid, we probably don't want to keep declining that activity. So, looking to make adjustments, on that front. And then on the other side, right, if we're getting fraud reported to us that has not hit a rule, we certainly, right, we want to see if there's opportunities there to address those. Either with a global rule that's going to, right, help all of, all the clients under that, either risk tolerance or, across the board, or if it's, a client specific rule that needs to be addressed. If it is more of a kind of a one-off trend, right, that's just impacting a certain credit union, that's certainly something that we like to also look at. And then this last item here, again, ID check. That's our verification tool. Right now, we are using it for withdrawals that are using an out-of-state ID over $200. So it can certainly be expanded beyond that, as acquirers, wish to use the tool, of course. But we've seen a lot of success, and we'll kind of dig into that here in a couple slides as well. Another really strong tool, and one that really, we've gotten some really good feedback, even outside of the, this fraud alert site that I'm going to cover, is communication in general, right? Industry communications. I know there's forums out there that, a lot of different institutions are, discussing different trends that they're seeing, emerging trends, things like that. But we see a lot of success just in our credit unions talking to each other. We'll go over a use case here in a minute that, essentially led to multiple arrests because our credit unions in a certain area talked, right? And so that's really the goal of this offering is when we have fraud or when we have suspects that are going into, branches and committing fraud, we want to get the word out, right? And so we will post on our fraud alert website information about these bad actors, the locations that they're going into, and so maybe even some details around the scheme that they're performing. So, for example, these top two even on this left screenshot, right, a cash withdrawal out of Oklahoma. We'll try to identify if it's a check or a cash withdrawal, or a little bit of specifics around what that trend looked like. And all of our credit unions that are registered will get an email alert notifying them that, hey, there's some fraud, there's a bad actor operating in Oklahoma. They can go in there and take a look at the suspect images, things like that. And so, right, if our credit unions are sharing that with their frontline staff, then they know the suspects to kind of keep an eye out for in their area. Again, we've had a couple of recent incidents, where our institutions have, confirmed that this process, as well as just the overall communication between them, has led to arrests. So this is kind of a highlight of really the Cooper fraud process, right? So kind of following here, starting on the far left, right, a member or a non-member, if it's a fraudster, enters a branch to attempt to do a transaction. Once that's submitted, right, it's going to go through obviously a series of checks, core checks, balance, things like that. It's also going to route through our Cooper Fraud Analyzer tool. And so it will go through the rules, the rules application that we have. And if criteria is met, it will create a case and then send that directly to the credit union, who will reach out to the member and verify if the activity was valid or not. Again, based on the response, right, we might take different actions on our side to kind of train our rules or to make updates there. One caveat that's not covered in here, right, is if we have a proof fraud that did not generate that case, right, that's fraud that went undetected, and definitely fraud that we want to know about. So I do kind of have a recommendation here, this middle one, right? We always want to have that fraud reported to us. We have a form available to obtain like key details with those incidents. also is how, right, branches can submit photo images, from the transaction to us, and we'll take those also and we'll post those on that Fraud Alert website. So we're going to talk a little bit about ID check and really some of what we've seen since we went live with this. So this is a newer tool. We went live on May 1st with this. In the 2 months afterward, we are seeing a 76% decrease in fraud. A really great number, right? And it makes sense because we're keeping those fraudsters out of the accounts up front. So can't stress enough, how valuable it is to have strong authentication controls up front. So thinking of the flow that we kind of stepped through in the previous slide, right? So this kind of highlights, right, the change that ID check adds. So, starting on the left, kind of in the middle with acquire, right, the member or bad actor goes into a bank. The very first step before a transaction is ever submitted. Of course, if the teller doesn't, suspect fraud as well, is going to be it's going to route through ID check. So we'll kind of go over what that verification and what that enrollment process looks like here in a second. But this is a step, right, that occurs before there's ever a transaction submitted. And then from there, right, we kind of go back into the same kind of workflow or process flow as mentioned before, where it's still going to route through fraud rules. Again, creating that layered approach, right? And if rules are met, then it'll go into that case management process of right, identifying if it's fraud and then providing that feedback back to your issuer. So kind of a highlight of ID check, right? Really a unified platform for fighting fraud. This is, I think, a tool that there's opportunity, right, within multiple platforms. Obviously, we are primarily using it and monitoring it very closely right now as a new product for shared branch. The benefits, again, right, is with ID check you have really one vendor, versus having multiple, which kind of helps streamline, right, if we need to make changes, which we certainly have had to make some model changes since launch, and we'll talk a little bit about what those look like. But I think you're right. Again, I think the kind of the key pieces here is that with ID check, really it decreases friction. There is an option where members can store their validation, right? So once that's done, we kind of have, right, our good population with stored credentials, and then we look at the new registrations or the new verifications a little bit more stringently, to see if there are bad actors also still trying to verify. So definitely seeing positive impacts both from a member experience and then also from a fraud mitigation. So kind of just a highlight, so really a couple different paths with ID check. This is kind of high level. So when a member enters a branch, there's QR codes that are going to be posted at the teller stations. The member experience, kind of what that looks like, right, is you will upload your ID into this tool, both the front and back. ID check will do analytics both on right, the different elements on the front, and then also we'll look at the barcode on the back and do some verification checks there. If everything clears, it will provide an access code, which is then brought to the teller, and the member can continue conducting business. The other side we mentioned is stored credentials. So when the member logs in, ID check should already have their information saved, and it will go to right, providing more of a seamless experience. So they don't have to upload the ID again, and go through all of those steps. Instead it's going to go kind of fast track you to the access code and going to the teller line. So what are we seeing after 2 months of being live, about 2.5 months, I guess, of being live with ID check? So highlighting, right, the stored validations, right, because this really is a nice member experience, I think, item. We went from 26% stored validations in May up to 41% in June. So we're definitely seeing, right, good adoption. This really should be, again, helping kind of create that seamless experience. Overall, of all the ID checks that have been entered into the system, we're seeing a success rate of 89%, so almost 90%. A portion of those, of course, are going to be fraud. So there are some different points there that, right, could result in a failure, and then they may have to just redo, right, the verification. That said, 90%, considering that a good portion of those are fraud, we're pretty pleased with. So Another stat here, so 400 verification attempts declined. We're pretty confident that these are fraud attempts. So these did not pass what we refer to as the image alert list or barcode analysis. Just to touch real quick on kind of what the image alert list looks like. Essentially, that is taking the photo on the ID and looking through our previous verifications and seeing if there's a match. So kind of doing that biometric check to see if this individual specifically already exists in the system with DPI. A couple other notes here. So again, we have seen pretty steep fraud decrease since we've gone live with ID check, 76%. We're also seeing a reduction in basis points. So that's a comparison, right, of our sales compared to our fraud losses at just 0.66. So that, right, a very low. I think, right, when we're talking about like cards, debit cards or credit cards, right, normal industry averages, I think, 5 to 10. So, definitely seeing a nice reduction there. Again, kind of, talking about, we now have this authentication, tool up front. We also continue to, monitor rule performance to see, what opportunities are there even with ID check in place. Even with this tool, we're still seeing almost a 70%, 68% fraud savings driven by the Cooper fraud rules. And then just the last item I kind of mentioned, right? We went live with this on May 1st. This is a requirement essentially for any withdrawal being done for shared branch at a different acquire location with an out-of-state ID. So it's not used for every shared branch transaction, but this does cover, I think, the highest risk scenarios. Of course, we want to have the technology that, that provides the best security and the best member, experience. However, we did see some fraud coming through early on. So kind of what we were seeing, is, just a handful of individuals, again, that had numerous sets of PII. So that, they were, taking over multiple accounts. So the top one, this was really the first instance that we saw after going live with ID check. We observed 7 different sets of PII tied to this individual. They were apprehended within the first week of, I guess, conducting their business, or committing fraud. So really just, a shout out to, the frontline staff, in that area, really for both of these. Both of these bad actors were, apprehended within a week or two of, us first detecting them. And a lot of that comes down to, the branches were talking. They were notifying each other that, hey, we have this person, sharing the images, coming into our branches and, committing fraud. This image on the right, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier too. This is kind of what it looks like, for our image alert list. So we have a specific value that we see from ID check if we find a hit, if we find a matching photo for a suspect. And so we're able to leverage that along with the account details, along with some of our internal reporting to be able to look at those hits and then kind of back into what does the account activity look like, we have this risk code that says that we have different IDs in here for this individual, but kind of trying to create that whole story of being able to identify what accounts those were. So being able to find the accounts that this specific individual had accessed or tried to access. We talked a bit about some of the enhancements that we made to our models with ID check, especially after seeing kind of those early on, bad actors having a little bit of success in Florida and New York is kind of the areas that they were targeting. Again, between the two of those two bad actors, we saw over 20 different sets of PII or 20 accounts that they were trying to, essentially take over. So certainly made some changes early on. So just within the first 2 weeks, we added the image alert list feature. Again, this has been really fruitful for our teams, not only to detect and stop fraud, to be able to also investigate some of those instances on our side. We have a little bit better reporting around it rather than waiting for fraud to be reported. We're able to go out there and kind of self-identify some of these and update our rules to target those areas a little bit more specifically. We also had a couple model updates. So just we made the decision to get a little bit more a little bit more strict with the checks that do take place. So, right, mentioned that there's some screening that goes on with the ID itself with the barcode, and then there's an analysis that goes on with the barcode as well. And so we noticed that some of those were a little blurry when they were coming through, things like that. And oftentimes those were, not always, but oftentimes those were being associated with fraud. And so just being a little bit more strict with some of those has helped us to also decline some additional fraud cases. As a result of this, so looking from month one, being May with ID check to month two, again, we saw from one month to the next, we saw a 90% reduction in fraud losses being reported. So again, I think really just kind of showing that that authentication step is really impactful. Okay, so I kind of want to kind of close us out with, again, just kind of a recap and a high level overview of specific shared branch trends that we're seeing, and then some kind of best practices that, we like to offer credit unions as well, and some that we do as well on our side. So, recent trends, definitely kind of mentioned, right, fraudulent account opening, altered check deposits being associated with that. So, a lot of these, we see multiple kind of flares, if you will, within the same trend. So oftentimes, right, we see a fraudulent account get opened, and then immediately, right, maybe we see a check deposit. And when what we're hearing and what we're seeing is that although these checks are also, a little bit more sophisticated, a lot of times they're manipulated. So rather than just a account that doesn't exist and a valid check, sometimes we're seeing that the MICR line is being altered, right? And so you might have a personal check from whoever, or we've seen investment type like E-Trade type of checks, things like that. But in reality, the payment information, right, has been completely altered, and so it doesn't tie to the account that you would expect it to. So that can certainly be a red flag, right? As as we're kind of looking at those up front, it could be an opportunity, right, to see, does the routing number belong to, the bank name on the check itself. Again, yeah, we are seeing, more, fraud transactions, right? Maybe it'll start at the account level, but the funds are being moved through other means, right? So we're definitely seeing a shift where fraudsters are levering not just one channel, but multiple channels to be able to kind of commit the fraud attack. Again, account takeover and ID theft attempts still very prevalent. Within that space, we're seeing a combination of either check withdrawals or cashier's check withdrawals. I think a lot of the times with cash, what we see now is more attempts but lower dollar. Fraudsters seem to be right. They kind of tend to feel out, where those limits are, where they're starting to see friction within the rules, and so they'll kind of try to stay under those thresholds. And so we see that with cash as well. With cashier's checks, we do have more valid activity at higher thresholds, and so we see a little bit higher dollar amount when it comes to cashier's checks. So again, that's something, right, I think is important to kind of call out is since we do see a lot of valid with that is looking at the account itself. Is this a brand new account? Have they ever done activity in shared branch, or have they ever done in branch activity? Depending on your scenario, and then right, kind of building out that full picture of that account, and does it make sense? So some quick best practices, and then we'll kind of shift gears here. Again, is I think that one of the top is frontline staff, right? This is a great opportunity to make sure that they are aware of fraud that's going on in the industry, right, and to be on the lookout for specific red flags, really to follow those know your customer type protocols, making sure that they are vetting not only the person that's standing in front of them, the ID to make sure that it makes sense, that it looks correct, but also, right, what does the account look like, and does that all make sense? Additionally, the layered approach to come back to that, of course, not only relying on rules or authentication practices, right, but having some holds on scenarios that are deemed as more risky, higher dollar amounts, multiple within a short time frame, either transactions or deposits, whatever that trend looks like. A couple other opportunities that could be out there as well. reviewing, high balance accounts or inactive accounts. And maybe, taking action or flagging those accounts so that, right, if all of a sudden we start to see some, activity with those, then, right, we have those kind of top of mind. And then just last item here is just, again, that reminder, we definitely still depend and, we see a lot of value in all the fraud that gets reported to us. So certainly want to encourage all of our clients and participating clients to, send those examples over to us. This really helps us, not only address fraud for, the institutions reporting fraud, but also it helps, fraud across the entire consortium. So we'll stop there. We do have a little bit of time yet to, if there's any questions, anything for us that we can help, or maybe if your institution is seeing completely something different, certainly happy to hear that feedback as well.
I think we're just all blown away with the insights, Zach, that you shared. And one thing that came to mind as I'm thinking about, all that you shared is this is really fraud prevention is a multi-layered approach. And so it was really nice to see. And I know that ID check specifically, it being a biometric authentication tool has really helped stop a lot, if not most or all, identity theft or account takeover fraud. So that is reassuring to see. But certainly with the tools, with Cooper Fraud Analyzer, ID Check, our other stakeholders like tellers and, all of us collectively in the tools, it's a multi-layered approach for fraud prevention.
You can always reach out to me directly as well via email, with specific questions or anything as well. And, happy to respond that way as well.
Right. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions coming in right now. If there is anything that comes up in the next few days, weeks, feel free to contact myself and we can get you in touch with Zach and Ashley. Zach, thank you so much for the presentation today. It was excellent. And Ashley, thank you so much for jumping on as well. And that's it for the webinar Wednesday session with Velera. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having us.